Welcome back to our studios here in Lahore. I'm Hamza Amjad, and let's start the bulletin with Yemen. 5 government soldiers have been killed in an attack in southern Abyan province. An official says the attack has destroyed 2 armored vehicles with rocket-propelled grenades. Earlier, 5 Houthi rebels and 3 government soldiers were killed during clashes in the port city of Hodeidah. Now, the government forces spokesman says the fighting erupted after Houthi militia attacked areas under government control. The violence comes 4 days after the warring sides resumed negotiations to implement a ceasefire in Hodeidah. Saudi Arabia says it paid $4 billion to the UN in aid for neighboring Yemen this year. This comes after the UN called out Saudi Arabia and the UAE for paying less than they pledged to a humanitarian appeal for the country. The Saudi UN ambassador Abdullah al-Muallimi says the kingdom gave more money than other donors. He says Saudi Arabia has sent aid worth $15 billion since the start of the conflict.
This year alone, which you are referring to, we had paid more money into Yemen than any of the donors in the world.
Saudi Arabia intervened in Yemen in 2015 in a bid to restore the government overthrown by the Iran-aligned Houthi movement. And now let's move on. Gibraltar's Supreme Court has extended the detention of an Iranian oil tanker until August the 15th. The announcement comes after the initial order authorizing seizure of the vessel lapsed. Gibraltar's Attorney General Michael Lamas says the order followed a short hearing in front of Chief Justice Anthony Dudley. Earlier, Gibraltar's Chief Minister held talks with Iranian officials in London about the supertanker. Gibraltar arrested the tanker earlier this month on suspicion of carrying Iranian crude oil to Syria in breach of EU sanctions. Moving on to the US, where President Donald Trump says the US Navy shot down an Iranian drone in the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, Iran's military says all of the country's UAVs have returned safely to base. Trump says the USS Boxer destroyed the Iranian aircraft when it came within 1,000 yards of the vessel. He says the drone was destroyed after it ignored multiple calls to stand down. Trump has called on other countries to condemn Iran and protect their own ships.
This is the latest of many provocative and hostile actions by Iran against vessels operating in international waters. The United States reserves the right to defend our personnel, our facilities, and interests, and calls upon all nations to condemn Iran's attempts to disrupt freedom of navigation and global commerce. I also call on other nations to protect their ships as they go through the strait and to work with us in the future.
Now, earlier, Iran said it seized a foreign tanker and its 12-member crew, alleging it was smuggling fuel in the Gulf. Washington has called on Tehran to release the tanker immediately. And now, in a related development, U.S. Central Command Chief General Kenneth McKenzie says Washington will work aggressively to enable free passage in the Gulf. Talking to reporters in Riyadh, McKenzie said the U.S. is working on an international maritime security coalition to ensure freedom of navigation. He says the U.S. does not seek a war with Iran, but will deter Tehran from destabilizing the region. The United States has beefed up its military presence in the Middle East following attacks on oil tankers in Gulf waters in recent months. Well, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani says all doors are open to save the 2015 nuclear deal. Now, in a phone call with French President Emmanuel Macron, Rouhani said the EU should accelerate efforts to save the pact. Macron also called Russia's President Vladimir Putin to discuss the future of the deal after the US withdrawal. The Kremlin says both sides agreed to safeguarding the deal and is essential for peace in the Middle East. Now, for more on the US-Iran conflict, we're joined by James Dorsey, who's a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. First of all, James, thanks for your time and welcome to Indus News. Now, we've seen conflicting narratives which have been pouring in from both sides over what has occurred during the past 2 months. Who do you believe?
I'm not sure that we can believe either of the two parties at this point. Neither has a really credible record. What I do think is it's interesting that the Iranians clearly want to downplay the possibility of there having been a drone incident. With other words, which points to the fact that both parties, amid escalating tension and the risk that they cannot control this getting out of hand, both parties do not really want a military conflict or confrontation.
Well, General McKenzie says that the U.S. is working on an international maritime security coalition to ensure freedom of navigation. What do you think are the chances of this escalating into violence in the region?
Basically, what that would mean is that you get the escorting of commercial vessels, oil tankers and others. That does not in and of itself necessarily have to lead to an escalation. It really depends on, in a sense, external factors. So, with other words, attacks on tankers that you've seen, including also now the holding of a commercial vessel by Iran, really are messages rather than attempts to escalate the situation or responses to make clear that Iran will not stand by idly as an American-led coalition tries to contain it.
Well, Mr. Dorsey, both sides say they don't want war, but what are they doing to stop that from happening?
Well, I think the problem with this is that it's sort of a tit for tat, if you wish. The Americans, egged on by the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Israelis, and by President Trump's own convictions that are long-standing, have taken what are very harsh measures against Iran, and Iran is fighting back. Now, having said that, that's a situation that in and of itself is not sustainable and either gets resolved by negotiations or ultimately is likely to escalate.
Thank you, Mr. James Dorsey, for speaking to us. Let's move on now. 4 government soldiers were killed when rebels launched a rocket attack on their military post in southern Idlib. The attack comes after the rebel coalition claimed that Moscow deployed special forces in Syria to aid its government forces. Now, meanwhile, Russian airstrikes have killed the commander of the Al-Sham rebel group in northern Latakia. With the latest casualties, the death toll has risen to over 2,500 since the recent escalation began in April. Moving on to Iraq, where Turkey has launched an air attack on the Kurdistan region in response to the killing of its diplomat in Erbil. Turkey's defense ministry says the attack inflicted a heavy blow on Kurdish militants in northern Iraq. It says armaments, militant positions and their shelters were targeted. This came after a Turkish diplomat was killed along with 3 others in a suspected Kurdish attack in the region. Now, a Kurdish spokesman denied the group's involvement in the deadly shooting. And in Iraq, 8 ISIS militants have been killed in fresh clashes. 6 ISIS fighters were killed in a US-led airstrike in the northern province of Nineveh. 2 militants were killed and 4 others wounded in clashes with Iraqi soldiers in the eastern Diyala province. A spokesman for the US-led coalition in Iraq says it carried out an airstrike on an ISIS position in the Al-Baj area near Iraq's northern border with Syria. The coalition has carried out several anti-ISIS operations in North and East Iraq in the recent weeks. Well, incoming European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the EU does not want a hard Brexit. The future EU chief hinted Britain may be given an extension in Brexit talks if London provides good reasons for it. She added an orderly departure was important to launch future ties on a good foot. In an interview, Leyen said the EU will wait for a new British Prime Minister to be chosen before pursuing talks. Earlier, British MPs voted to prevent a future Conservative leader from suspending Parliament to force through a no-deal exit. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Mr. David Hearn, who is a researcher at the Centre for Brexit Studies at Birmingham City University in England. Welcome to Indus News and thank you for your time. First of all, European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen has hinted at giving an extension to Britain. How much more time do you think that the EU can give?
It's a difficult question to answer. I think that they will want any extension to be, the length of any extension will be contingent upon the reason for that extension. So if it's in order to hold a future election, then I suspect a rather long extension it would be in order. If, on the other hand, it's for for example, for further negotiations, then the short extension would be likely.
Right, so what challenges are there for a new Prime Minister after MPs block a bid to stop the future Conservative leader from suspending Parliament to force through a no-deal Brexit?
Well, I think first of all, let's note that this doesn't stop a no-deal Brexit from happening.
Right.
It merely prevents the Prime Minister from forcing a no-deal Brexit in a way that doesn't allow Parliament to have any say. The question then becomes, if Parliament does indeed want to prevent a no-deal Brexit, how do they go about doing that? And the legal mechanisms to do so are not entirely clear at the moment. There are a variety of mechanisms they might seek to use, and I suspect that they will. But it is going to be more challenging, I think, than it was previously.
Right, Mr. David Hearn, what do you think? Is it Boris Johnson or Jeremy Hunt who will be able to do that?
I mean, look, I think that it's highly likely, most of us are assuming that Boris Johnson will indeed become Conservative Party leader. I think that's likely. I mean, there's always the possibility of an upset, but it's overwhelmingly probable that Boris Johnson will become Prime Minister. The question then becomes, okay, well, what policies is he likely to pursue? And will he go through on his threat and trying to deliver a no-deal Brexit? And if he does go through on that threat, how will Parliament respond? Parliament will try and stop him. There's no question about that. The question is, what mechanisms will they invoke to do so? And that's quite an interesting question and imposes a number of difficult questions for parliamentarians wanting to go down that route.
Right, thank you, Mr. David. Thanks for your time. He was joining us there from Birmingham City University in England. And now we're going to take a break, but don't go anywhere. I'll be back with more stories. Welcome back. Now, German Chancellor Angela Merkel says Britain would remain a partner even if it is no longer a member of the EU in the future. Merkel says work with the next British Prime Minister will depend on his approach to the European Commission. Criticizing the US president, Merkel said Donald Trump's tweets go against American values and what makes it great. Addressing her annual summer news conference, she dismissed concerns regarding her health. Merkel asserted she was fit to carry on as Chancellor after a number of episodes of trembling. She said a weaker European economy gives Germany the motivation to stimulate its domestic economy. She blamed uncertainty in global trade for the economic slowdown. Nigerian rebels have killed 6 soldiers in an ambush in the northeastern state of Borno. Heavily armed ISIS militants attacked a vehicle patrolling near the Jacana army base. The Nigerian army says militants then attacked the base in 7 trucks fitted with machine guns. Soldiers were on their way to Maiduguri when the ambush happened. This came hours after a military chief in the northeast warned terrorists to disarm or face destruction. In Afghanistan, 8 people have been killed and over 30 others injured in a blast outside Kabul University. The explosion happened as a number of students were waiting outside the campus to attend an exam. Eyewitnesses say 2 vehicles caught fire after the explosion at the university entrance. No group has yet claimed responsibility. This comes a day after 12 people were killed in a car bomb attack in southern Kandahar. While the number of people forced from their homes in Bangladesh's flood-affected areas has risen to 400,000 after 4 rivers burst their banks. Heavy rains and overflowing rivers have swamped 23 districts in Bangladesh. 59 people have died in the country's worst floods this week. Rescue workers say the government has opened nearly 1,000 temporary shelters for flood victims. Well, the Democratic Republic of Congo says the WHO's naming of Ebola as a global emergency will harm its economy. The country fears the move will prompt neighbouring states to close their borders, stopping the supply of goods and other products. More in this report.
The WHO has declared the Ebola virus outbreak in Congo to be public health emergency of international concern. The move could encourage wealthy donor countries to provide more cash. But Congo fears its economy will suffer if neighboring countries impose travel and trade restrictions to counter the risk of the disease spreading.
The DRC should not close their borders. If the borders are closed, Rwanda will suffer a very negative impact on his economy.
African countries depend on imports from neighboring states, and the closure of borders is expected to affect the regional economy.
It's well known that Ituri, North and South Kivu provinces all rely on products from neighboring countries in east of Africa like Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania and Kenya.
The WHO has urged countries to keep transport routes and borders open while increasing surveillance at entry points. The global health body has appealed for more funds to quickly roll back the outbreak. The current epidemic in DR Congo has killed more than 1,600 people.
Well, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has met his German counterpart Heiko Maas to discuss the Ukraine crisis. The meeting was held on the sidelines of a two-day bilateral forum in the German town of Königswinter. The German foreign minister says both sides differ on eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. But Maas says no solution is possible without Russian involvement, so the two countries will work together to end the conflict. Relations between Russia and Germany have been strained since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. The ministerial level meeting between Berlin and Moscow is the first since in 5 years. The conflict and annexation prompted Germany to sanction Russian companies. China says Australia must not interfere in Beijing's detention of writer Yang Hengjun. This comes after the Australian Foreign Ministry called for Yang's immediate release. China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Gang Shuang says Yang was suspected of criminal activity which endangers state security. Shuang says compulsory measures will be taken to proceed with Yang's trial. Yang was detained by China in January amid growing tensions between Australia and its largest trading partner. South Korea says Japan has violated the principles of free trade and international law by imposing unilateral export restrictions. Seoul has also rejected Tokyo's call for third-party arbitration over a wartime labor dispute. South Korea's trade ministry asked Japan for another round of talks over Tokyo's tighter export controls. Meanwhile, Tokyo has summoned South Korea's ambassador amid heightened economic and political tensions. Japan's foreign ministry says Seoul must take swift steps to resolve the dispute. Tensions between the two sides have been escalating since Tokyo imposed restrictions on tech exports to South Korea. Now, in retaliation, South Koreans have boycotted Japanese brands and cancelled trips. While the world's longest electric vehicle trip has come to an end in New Zealand, Dutch adventurer Wiebe Wacker completed the journey after a 3-year drive. Take a look.
To prove this, Wiebe Wacker drove his retrofitted station wagon, Blue Bandit, across more than 30 countries. He set off from the Netherlands in March 2016 and completed an epic 101,000 kilometers journey.
So I wanted to do my bit to promote this technology and show that sustainable mobility is a viable way of transport. So I wanted to really do something that really speaks to the imagination, which is driving an electric car from Amsterdam to literally the other side of the world to show that it can be done.
Wacker's 3-year trip was funded by public donations from around the world. During the drive, people also offered Wacker food, a place to sleep and electricity to charge the vehicle.
In my original plan I used the IKEA map to plan my trip, and New Zealand was not on there. So that's how I ended up in Australia, and when I finished there were some local people some Kiwis who I think were a bit offended that I was saying I'm traveling to the other side of the world and then stopping in Sydney.
Throughout the journey, Walker regularly updated his blog and social media with updates about his experiences and progress. He says the electric vehicle can travel 200 kilometers just a single charge.
In Taiwan, an artist in the village of Ruan Chiao is painting murals to ease loneliness for the elderly. Nestled in the foothills of Taiwan's central mountain range, the village is devoid of young people. And Wu Sun Sin is filling the space with street art. More in this report. Rapid economic growth has led to increased urbanization in Taiwan. This has left many villages without young people. But Wu is injecting life into the village by transforming local homes into a canvas of color.
This village is full of old people. These drawings attracted many tourists to come visit. The old people who were left here would not be so bored. This was my biggest gain.
Through his work, Wu highlights social problems, including climate change and corruption. There are some half a dozen graffiti villages in Taiwan that have been decorated with artwork in a bid to bring rural places back to life.
Taiwan has many graffiti villages that are beautiful, scenic spots where people would leave after taking pictures. But I realized when I came here that every mural here is depicting a social problem. The artist is trying to convey through irony these social problems to the younger generation.
He hopes to woo other young Taiwanese to explore rural villages more often. First up in the world of business, the European Commission has imposed a fine of $272 million on US chip-making giant Qualcomm in Brussels. This comes after Qualcomm stopped rivals from remaining in the market a decade ago. EU Antitrust Commissioner Margaret Vestager says Qualcomm blocked competition by offering predatory prices between 2009 and 2011. The Commissioner says the chips are the key components to connect mobile devices with the internet. Qualcomm said the company will file an appeal against the decision.
So today the Commission has decided to fine Qualcomm 242 million euros for an anti-competitive behavior that is illegal under EU antitrust rules.
And let's have a look at the weather around the world. Well, that was all I have from the news bulletin at the moment, but do stay tuned to Indus News for further updates. And as always, thanks for watching.